Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to dive into the academic readings that will help us figure out how to write a new chapter about race and ethnicity from the mid-19th to the 1890s. And the first article that I'm asking you to read offers an interpretation that tries to bring together the stories of various minority groups in the U.S. in a single article. And I'll start with some advice on how to read academic articles. And so first off, sometimes academic articles offer what we call an abstract. And that's what you see in italics here at the beginning of the article. And sometimes people skip over this, and that's a big mistake. The abstract is there to help you. It offers a brief summary of the article. Essentially, it's a shortcut for you. It gives you essential information that you don't have to figure out as you dive into the article. And so this is a short abstract. Usually if the article offers one, the abstract is at least twice as long. Still, this abstract offers important information that will help you. So follow along with me as I read this short abstract, and then I'll help you break it down. So it says, during what might be called the Great Reconstruction, 1846 to 1877, territorial acquisitions as well as Southern slavery forced a new racial dialogue between West and South. Unsettled racial relations and presumptions, and finally led to a new racial order encompassing Western as well as Southern people of color. And so right off the bat, we know the author is going to offer a different time period for Reconstruction. So remember from the textbook reading that Reconstruction is generally understood as from 1865 to 1877. So he's giving us a different interpretation that he calls the Greater Reconstruction, right, which lasts from 1846 to 1877. And one of the important things that historians do is they break history into periods in order to help us make sense of historical changes. Otherwise, history just becomes a bunch of stuff that happens, and we don't really have any grasp of the turning points in history. And so the next clause, territorial acquisitions as well as Southern slavery forced a new racial dialogue between West and South. This shows us that this article is going to focus, isn't just going to focus on the South. Right? Remember that the chapter on Reconstruction we read from the textbook sees Reconstruction as something unfolding in the South concerning the rights of former slaves would have after the Civil War. And we know from reading this abstract that the author wants to include the West into this story. An important shift that he points out here is the territorial acquisitions that the U.S. gains between 1846 and 1877. Right? And so the last part of the abstract tells us that this process unsettled racial relations and presumptions and finally led to a new racial order encompassing Western as well as Southern people of color. Okay, so now the author is getting to the big change that unfolds during this period. The reason we create periods, again, is to explain and make sense of big changes in history. We know that he is going to argue that the end of slavery and Western territorial acquisitions will unsettle racial relations and presumptions. So in the article we're going to look for how that happens. Right? What were the basic ideas at the beginning of this period, and then how do those ideas change? Then we're going to look for what he calls a new racial order that takes hold by the end of the period, and we need to figure out what that looks like. And so as you read this article, I want you to take notes that will help you not only with the quiz, but also with this week's assignment. You know that your ultimate job this week is to provide advice on how to write a new chapter on race and ethnicity that spans the mid-19th century to the 1890s. So take note of important terms, people, legislation, court cases, etc. that aren't in the textbook reading that we did, but you think are important to add to a new textbook chapter. All right, so now let's take a look at the second article that I'm going to ask you to read. This article is about the significance of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which, if you remember, is in the textbook reading. We're reading this because in writing a new chapter, we want to explain better to the readers the significance of this period that we're writing about. Textbooks, high school textbooks especially, do a poor job explaining why certain pieces of legislation or new ideas change the course of history. It's one of the things that make high school history textbooks so boring. Without explanations about the significance and legacy of the stuff in the textbook, the chapter reads like this happens and then this happens and this person did something, the end. We don't want that. We want to let readers know why they are reading about all of these people and events. We want readers to know that they're spending time on all of this stuff. To understand some fundamental transformation in U.S. history. And so the first article helps us get at some of those transformations, but it ends in 1877. This second article is going to help us extend those transformations we read about in the first article and extend them to the end of the 19th century. And so you'll see right away in the title of this article, that this article goes all the way to 1924, and you might be asking, are we ending this new textbook chapter in the 1890s? Why are we reading something that goes to 1924? And the answer is if we want to explain the significance of a piece of legislation like the Chinese Exclusion Act in our new textbook chapter, we want to explain to the reader that it has long-term consequences. Right? And so this article is going to help us explain some of those long-term consequences. So here's some useful advice when you're reading this academic article, right? So whether there's an abstract or not, you have to read the first few paragraphs carefully. And so there's no abstract here. So this is where in these first few paragraphs is where the author outlines the argument and gives you a sense of what's going to follow. And so you'll see in this first paragraph that the author uses what we call an anecdote, which is really a short story that tries to hook you and get you interested. The second paragraph is something that you're probably not used to. Unless you've taken an upper-level college course in the social sciences or the humanities. And this is what we call a historiographical intervention paragraph. And some other disciplines call it a literature intervention. So basically, scholars can't publish something just because they want to. They have to justify why other scholars should care. And to do that, they have to explain what's been written about the topic they're writing about and how their article is unique and advances the field. And so for our purposes in this class, it's not important to know the intervention in the field, but it does give you a sense of what's coming in the article. And so you can see here a list of questions that the author is interested in, and you assume that those will be answered in the rest of the article. The next paragraph gives us better insight into what we want to pay attention to for our own purposes in this class. And so the first sentence tells us that the purpose of this article is to explain how the Chinese Exclusion Act is a watershed moment in American history. Then she lays out her argument, and that's something that we always look for in academic articles. And the author is being nice because she gives you a big red flag that tells you that this sentence contains her argument by writing, "It is my argument." Sometimes authors aren't so nice and you have to figure out the argument on your own, right? But here, this author is being nice. So let's read the sentence together. It is my argument, however, that Chinese exclusion introduced a gatekeeping ideology, politics, law, and culture that transformed the ways in which Americans viewed and thought about race, immigration, and the United States identity as a nation of immigration. And so this sentence tells you that the rise of a gatekeeping ideology is going to be key to this article, and we need to figure out what that means. And the next few sentences gives you a brief outline of what that means, but you really need to dive into the rest of the article to understand it fully. And one thing that you'll find is that reading academic work is more difficult than reading bland textbook chapters, right? So if you struggle a bit, don't fret. If you get stuck on something and can't figure it out, you can always email me and I'll help you through it. Remember that there's a quiz that is simply there to make sure that you do the reading. There's no time limit, and you can open the quiz before you start reading.